George noticed two things when he awoke. The first, as he slid his eyes open a crack, was the loud, rapid pounding emanating from the roof overhead. The sound of the torrential rain hitting the aluminum was almost as loud as gunfire, coming in a relentless metallic cacophony. Similar sounds battered the bedroom window behind the heavy, closed curtains, intensifying for a few seconds as the howling wind sent the downpour into a sideways spiral with all the ferocity of a lion tamer's whip. As he slowly drifted into consciousness, he opened his eyes wider, then quickly clamped them shut again as a blinding flash of lightning temporarily turned the outside world, and subsequently the bedroom from pitch black to sterile white day. It was accompanied by a piercing, window-rattling clap, and as the light died away, the loudest, deepest rumble of thunder he had ever heard in his life took its place, vibrating straight through the floorboards. The second was the unmistakable, insistent pressure in his bladder. He let out a quiet, defeated sigh into the pillow. Of course. He'd been explicitly warned by Dr. Mathis at his last physical that, at his age, drinking too many liquids before bed would begin forcing middle-of-the-night trips to the bathroom. But George hadn't taken the warning seriously. After all, he still felt relatively young. Hell, he was only going to turn 37 this coming September. And where tonight marked his 16th wedding anniversary, he'd chosen to celebrate with his wife by indulging in a few extra glasses of the Dom Perignon he'd kept for special occasions after sending the kids upstairs to bed. Damn you, Dr. Mathis, he thought. The sudden flash of bitterness was entirely misplaced, but wrapped in the heavy, sour fog of a midnight hangover, George didn't care. Letting out another sharp exhale and exercising absolute caution not to wake his wife, he slowly slid the heavy wool covers back and brought himself to a sitting position on the edge of the mattress. Rubbing one calloused palm over his face, he reached out with the other hand and picked his watch up from the organized mess on the nightstand, pressing down on the crown with slightly more force than necessary. The dial of the Timex lit up with a soft, mint-green glow, the chunky hands declaring the time to be exactly 14 minutes after 2 in the morning. Sliding his feet into his worn fleece slippers, he forced himself to stand, casting a lingering glance down at the still form occupying the opposite side of the king-sized bed. Jane slept soundly, her muscles completely relaxed and unbothered, as another flash of lightning silhouetted the room, followed by another flat clap and rumble. If it wasn't for the slight, rhythmic rise and fall of the quilt over her chest, he could almost believe she was a corpse. He would never admit it to her face, but he was profoundly envious of how deep a sleeper she could be. That woman could sleep through a Category 5 hurricane, he thought, a faint, affectionate smile momentarily breaking through the grogginess. Setting the watch back on the nightstand, he softly crept across the carpet to the bedroom door and clicked it open, revealing the narrow hallway beyond. The soft, amber glow of a seashell nightlight plugged into the baseboard at the far end of the hall offered just enough illumination to guide his steps, allowing him to navigate the narrow corridor without flicking on the overhead light and blinding himself. Gripping the wooden banister that separated the thin carpeted path from the steep stairwell, he shuffled down towards the landing until he came to a halt outside the children's room. Despite the increasingly painful pressure urging him toward the bathroom, George gently turned the brass handle and cracked the door open a few inches. Peering into the narrow shaft of light that filtered inside, he watched his two boys sleep. Neither Jonathan or Charlie stirred. Satisfied, a quiet wave of paternal relief softening his shoulders, he pulled the door shut until the latch clicked soundlessly. He turned to step around the end of the banister toward the bathroom at the head of the stairs, and froze. At the end of the hall, resting in the deep shadows directly to the left of the boys' room, was the door to the spare room. It had been converted at Jane's fierce insistence. In case any of our old friends or relatives end up driving down from the city, she had argued, so they don't have to spend the night on that uncomfortable futon in your office. Yet, in the 5 long years since they had purchased the house, not a single soul had ever stayed overnight. George had never been able to decide if that was because their old city companions simply detested traveling out to an old, isolated house in the middle of nowhere, or if they simply didn't want to be a bother. But he did know one thing with absolute certainty. He hated that room. From the very first afternoon the real estate agent had led them on a tour of the property, something about that specific corner of the house had felt entirely off. He could never properly put it into words, never articulate it well enough to explain it to Jane without sounding unhinged. But the room possessed a heavy, curdled atmosphere that belonged to nowhere else. It felt like a geographic dead zone. The air inside always smelled faintly of dry dust and stagnant linen, no matter how often Jane cracked the windows, and the shadows in the corners seemed to cling to the baseboards with an unnatural, greasy density. Worse still was the attic panel built directly into the spare room's ceiling, a heavy wooden square reached only by pulling down a frayed cable that dangled like a miniature hangman's noose. When they had run out of space to stack cardboard boxes in the basement, George had been forced to haul the overflow up that creaking ladder. The very instant his shoes had hit the first rung of the ladder, and especially after his head had breached the darkness of the attic that was kept at bay only by a single hanging bulb, a chilling, paranoid sensation had fallen over him. It was a psychological toxicity that seemed to poison his better judgment, settling into his lungs like an invisible layer of asbestos. Up there, surrounded by the maze-like stacks of boxes, rotting insulation, cobwebs, and dead beetles, he had felt watched. It wasn't the vague unease of an old house shifting. It was the visceral, terrifying certainty of 100 pairs of unseen eyes boring holes into the back of his neck, all waiting in absolute anticipatory silence for him to turn his back in a single moment of carelessness. George shook his head sharply in the dark. "Knock it off," he hissed quietly to himself, his voice a flat whisper that was swallowed up by the sound of the rain. He was letting his imagination run away with itself again. That same overactive, treacherous imagination was the very thing that paid the bills. His career as a horror author had finally taken off last year, providing the financial injection that allowed him to yank his family out of that crummy, graffiti-stained apartment they had endured for 6 years and transplant them out here in the quiet. But that paycheck came with a curse. His mind had a nasty habit of conjuring up horrific architectures out of empty air, a psychological flaw he had been forced to live with since he was a small child, hyperventilating in his bed and calling for his mother. Even now, as he stood frozen on the landing, staring at the closed door to the spare room, it manifested itself. Another flash of lightning flooded the hallway with a cold, electric glare, and George swore that within the sudden, mutating shadows of his peripheral vision, he saw distinct movement. It looked like a towering silhouette hiding in the corner, fluidly shifting its weight as if balancing itself against the wallpaper. The rational side of his brain knew with certainty that there was nothing actually there, that it was merely a trick of his optic nerves and the contrast of the lightning and ambient light, but it did little to make the primitive terror go away. It never did. The pressure in his bladder, now transcending from a dull ache into an almost agonizing, burning protest, snapped him out of his stupor. He forced himself to turn away from the corner and stepped quickly across the creaking floorboards, reaching out to push the bathroom door open, not bothering to pull it shut completely behind him. He swiped at the wall switch with the back of his hand. The unshaded, slightly dusty bulb over the sink snapped to life with a sharp buzz, making him squint and raise a hand against the sudden glare. He crossed the small blue-tiled space, flipped up the heavy toilet lid, and after hurriedly pulling down his pajama pants, began to finally relieve himself. As the steady stream made its way into the basin, George leaned forward, placing one hand against the cold drywall to steady his balance. He closed his eyes, letting the immense physical relief wash over him, while the heavy siren song of sleep began to drag his mind back toward the bedroom. A soft, self-deprecating snort escaped his nose. "Fine, no more late-night drinks for me, be it alcohol or otherwise, Doc," he whispered to the room, a quiet, sleepy chuckle bubbling up in his chest. The sound seemed incredibly sharp, cutting through the low hum of his laughter and the soft splashing in the basin. It was a tiny, localized noise, almost entirely buried beneath the thunderous soundtrack of the storm battering the house, almost but not quite. George's chuckle died in his throat. His eyes shot open, and he glanced around the room. For a long, motionless beat, his muscles remained tense as he listened over the mechanical roar of the rain. Nothing. Then it came again, drifting from what sounded like the floorboards somewhere outside the half-open door. He cocked his head, his brow furrowing as a third replication struck the wood, sounding distinctly louder, closer, and more deliberate than the first two had. George finished urinating, pulling his pajama pants back up as his eyes drifted to the window next to the toilet. Beyond the glass lay nothing but an absolute featureless void. "It's just an old house," he reasoned, his mind frantically assembling a line of defense against the noise. An old house creaking under the weight of a severe storm, or maybe a branch scraping against the side of the house. The thought did little to help, though. He knew there were no trees close enough to be able to touch it. He reached down and pushed on the toilet handle. The loud roar of the water swirling down into the great empty filled the small space, its familiar, thoroughly normal sound doing its job to reassure his slightly frayed nerves. He turned back towards the door, but just as his hand extended to seize the doorknob, a blinding flash of lightning struck the horizon, accompanied not even a second later by a deafening explosion of thunder that sounded as if a bomb had detonated directly against the side of the house. George was plunged into blackness. For a few long seconds, his brain whirred at 1,000,000 miles an hour, but like a heavy sedan stuck axles deep in the mud, logic spun its wheels and produced absolutely nothing. Nothing, that is, except a sudden, visceral, entirely irrational wave of pure dread. All at once, a terrifying, unshakable thought took root in his mind. If he did not find a light source, and find it within the next few seconds, something unspeakable was going to happen to him. His breath hitched in his throat, a cold bead of sweat breaking out on his forehead despite the cold room. A single memory finally broke through the static of his panic. The emergency flashlight they kept in the cabinet above the toilet. He began frantically fumbling in the black void, his hands scratching and scrambling against the wood sides and slats, trying to find the knobs. Fingers closing around them, he yanked the cabinet doors open, their hinges letting out a sharp whine that made his heart skip a beat. Behind him, through the half-open door to the hallway, he swore he heard the heavy rustle of movement out on the landing carpet. His fingers closed around the cold metal cylinder of the heavy-duty flashlight. Snatching it up, he spun around on his heel and slammed his thumb forward onto the switch, aiming the high-powered beam towards the doorway. The light pierced through the blackness. No visage of horror grinned back at him from the crack in the door. No nightmare entity stood poised to tear into his flesh. The faded, peeling white paint of the bathroom door was the only thing reflected in the glare. George stood still, frozen like a statue as he strained his ears to listen outside of the beam. He heard the heavy timbers of the old house shifting and groaning against the lashing wind and rain, locked in its mortal, midnight combat with the elements. But aside from the natural, predictable choreography of the storm, the hallway was dead silent. He let out a long, shuddering breath, feeling his pulse slow its pounding as his shoulders finally relaxed. A derisive, self-deprecating snort escaped his lips. "Power outage," he muttered aloud. "It's just a damn power outage." The snort quickly dissolved into a quiet, nervous snicker of laughter directed solely at himself for how much of an absolute chicken shit he had just acted like. Moving forward, he pushed the door open, sticking his head out onto the landing and panning the light around the hallway. Everything was exactly as it had been when he'd left the bedroom. "Good freaking God, man," he chided himself, shaking his head as he stepped out onto the landing. "I know you have an overactive imagination for an adult, but Jesus, you're supposed to use that brain to scare the shit out of your readers for a paycheck, not terrify yourself in your own bathroom. You're almost 40 years old. Jonathan and Charlie aren't even afraid of the dark anymore, and they're barely teenagers. Get a hold of yourself. He began to cross the landing to head back to bed and the warmth of his wife when a harsh, pragmatic memory brought him to a halt. What if the main lines were down for the count? This wasn't the first major outage they'd dealt with, and on more than one occasion, the utility trucks hadn't restored power until 12 hours later. Worse still was the memory of what had happened 6 months ago. Charlie had woken up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, and with the safety of the nightlight to guide him through the dark, the boy had tripped and struck his head hard against the doorframe. George could still vividly see the raw, pale face of pure terror on Jane's face when they had awoken to the sound of their son wailing. The subsequent rush to the emergency room was an experience of absolute paternal failure that he refused to ever invite into his house again. He let out a long, resigned sigh, turning away from the bedroom and aiming the light down the narrow cavern of a stairwell. "Generator it is then," he muttered. The previous owners had installed a massive diesel-powered generator in the basement. From what the real estate agent had claimed during the closing, they had done so because of the frequent grid failures along this rural stretch of the county, thoughtfully venting the exhaust pipe straight out through the foundation wall so nobody had to slog out to a backyard shed in a storm. George was eternally grateful for that design choice tonight, but the machinery came with a bitter caveat. Normally, the generator was designed to automatically trip and fire up the instant the main power lines cut out. Unfortunately, due to years of deferred maintenance by the prior occupants, the critical automatic transfer switch was broken. And after sinking almost every spare dollar from the royalty checks from his first 2 novels into the closing costs, leaving a hefty, multi-decade mortgage looming over his head like a noose on the gallows, George simply hadn't possessed the extra funds to have an electrician repair the panel just yet, which meant whenever a blackout arrived, it required a long, cold walk down to the bowels of the house to crank it by hand. Careful not to trip over the carpet runners lining the steps, George slowly began his descent to the ground floor. The old stairs squeaked their annoyance in sharp protest beneath his slippers, forcing him to keep his left hand clamped tight around the wooden banister to keep from waking anyone up. Halfway down the flight, he stopped dead. The hair along the back of his neck rose and stayed straight. Bracing himself, he turned and aimed the light back up at the empty upper floor landing. The bright white beam swept across the hallway railing and closed doors, reflecting off nothing but the faded 50-year-old wallpaper. There was nobody there, of course, but for a single second, he'd had the overwhelming sensation that either Jane or one of his sons had been standing at the head of the stairs, staring silently down at his back in the dark. Shaking his head at his own frayed nerves, he forced his legs to continue down. Reaching the bottom landing, he turned and aimed the flashlight down the central corridor. The house had been built with an incredibly strange, elongated design. It wasn't wide, but in length, it was a massive, echoing tunnel that extended far back onto the property. To his right lay the dark entryways to the dining room and front sitting room. To his left was the closed door to his writing office, and straight ahead, swallowed by the edges of the beam, was the hulking entrance to the living room, beyond which lay the kitchen and the basement door. Wanting nothing more than to click the breaker, turn the lights back on, and crawl back under the warm covers, he began striding down the hall, his slippers making a muted, syncopated thump-thump-thump against the oak floorboards. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the front windows, followed by a low rumble of thunder that had by now simply dissolved into the background noise of the night. As he passed the dark outline of the dining room door, a sudden spark of creative opportunism flickered through his mind. "You know, I could easily use this exact atmosphere as inspiration," he thought, his writer's brain instinctively trying to monetize his own discomfort. A short story, or maybe even the opening sequence for the next book. The publishing company had been aggressively riding his ass about releasing his next collection of horror shorts by the end of the year, and a piece set in a remote, drafty house, entirely cut off from any kind of outside help during a midnight storm, would be absolutely perf. George froze mid-stride, the creative train of thought instantly evaporating from his mind as the exact same scratching noise he'd heard upstairs echoed through the hollow corridor. He shot a sharp look over his shoulder, but the hall and front door behind him were empty. A thought suddenly occurred to him, and he groaned. "Oh, for the love of God, don't tell me we've got mice in here again." He had already spent a small fortune dealing with the little bastards 4 months ago, after finding them gnawing away at the basement insulation, and the only exterminator willing to drive this far out into the boonies was far from cheap. The sound came again, now seeming to emanate from the deep shadows of the sitting room. George backed up a few steps and pushed the door open, sweeping his light across the faded floral armchairs and the brick fireplace. Nothing moved in the stillness, letting out a soft, unconvinced, He closed the door and stood at the threshold. The sound instantly migrated, tapping against the walls of the very next room, the dining room. His jaw tightening, George stepped quickly to the adjoining door and slid inside. The flashlight beam reflected off the polished mahogany table that stood in the center of the room, the heavy chairs pulled in tight against its edge like silent sentinels. He panned the light over the glass cabinet of fine china against the far wall, then crouched low to the floor, aiming it beneath the table. Still nothing disturbed the dark. Standing back up, a sudden jagged knot of pure anxiety tightened in his throat. "What the fuck?" he whispered, his voice shattering the silence like a brick through a window. The response that came was one that short-circuited his mind. From across the narrow hallway, deep in the confines of his office, a sharp, heavy click echoed off the walls. George froze, his heart beginning to leap against his ribs. A fraction of a second later, a low motor began to spin up with a quiet, hollow hum. Then came the unmistakable pop and static crackle of a stylus needle dropping heavily into a vinyl groove. The acoustic strumming of a 12-string guitar drifted out into the dark, followed by the smooth, melancholy baritone of Gordon Lightfoot singing Sundown. George stood completely paralyzed, stunned into stillness for 3 long seconds as a tidal wave of existential dread washed over him. What in the actual fuck? Then, his panic began to scream at him, breaking the spell. "Turn it off before it wakes Jane and the boys." He bolted across the landing, the flashlight shaking and jerking erratically in his grip as he lunged into his office, shoving the door open. The music continued to roll out, the lyrics almost seeming to mock his terror.
Sundown, you better take care if I find you've been creeping round my back stairs.
Rushing directly to the filing cabinet, his hand dove out in the dark to seize the plastic power toggle. He slammed it back, plunging the room back into a dead, now suffocating silence. George stood bent over, his chest heaving as he aimed the flashlight down at the turntable platter. For a few moments, the confusion blurred his thoughts, until something occurred to him. The turntable was an old, battery-powered portable rig, meaning not even a blackout could stop it, but it required a physical force to push the power toggle and drop the stylus. He felt the sweat begin to form on his face again as he looked at the interface. The mechanical switch hadn't shorted out, it hadn't slipped. It had been clicked straight into the on position. But before his mind could even begin to construct an even remotely rational argument for that detail, a noise cut through the silence like a knife. The sound struck right behind his shoulder blade, the loudest and sharpest it had all night, seeming to scrape against the very wallpaper behind him. George didn't think. He didn't look back. He erupted out of the room like a rocket, his slippers sliding as he yanked the door shut behind him, his hand seizing the key in the lock and twisting it until he heard the tumblers engage. Chest heaving and the returning silence leaving a loud, tinnitus-like ringing in his ears. He pushed away from the door and moved much more quickly toward the safety of the living room and the basement door ahead. Every glance over his shoulder as he went simply kept showing him the empty hallway. But far from bringing him comfort, it made the paranoia he felt spike. It was as if the mere act of looking and aiming the flashlight beam back caused whatever was there to simply blink out of existence a split second before the photons could capture it. He felt toyed with, the exact way a cat maliciously toys with a cornered mouse before delivering the killing bite. Worse still, that heavy, paranoid sensation of being watched, the exact phantom malice that had covered him inside the spare room and up in the attic, had somehow drifted downstairs, infecting the parts of the house that had felt like a sanctuary in comparison. He burst into and across the expanse of the living room, the light sweeping over the familiar shapes of the couch, flat-screen television against the wall, and the stacks of DVD and VHS cases strewn across the floor in front of it. Everything sat in rigid, static silence, the normalcy now seeming mocking in its mundanity as the sound came again. Refusing to stop, George used the noise as motivation to move faster, reaching the separation between the carpet and the linoleum, rounding the corner past the breakfast bar, and lunging into the deep shadows of the kitchen. His slippers slapped against the tiles as he reached out a trembling hand to seize the handle of the basement door. George went rigid, the blood draining from his face so fast the room seemed to tilt. The heavy groan hadn't been a different version of the scratching noise that had stalked him throughout the house. It was the unmistakable sound of the floorboards in the living room being stepped on. He knew that sound intimately. Whenever he stood at the stove making breakfast, that exact creak signified that either Jane or one of the kids had just rolled out of bed and was about to appear around the large partition that separated the two rooms. Every survival circuit in his brain ordered his limbs to yank the basement door open, to launch down the stairs, and not look back, but he couldn't help it. It was as if he had slid into a deep, waking trance. His neck commanded against his will to slowly turn back toward the living room entrance. If he could have screamed, his lungs would have ruptured. A thick, massive hand was slowly reaching around the edge of the doorway, but it wasn't a hand. You couldn't rightly call something like that a hand in any human sense, when the flesh was smothered in a coat of matted, coarse brown fur that more resembled the pelt of a beast. Nor could you call what the fingers ended in fingernails. They were long, curved, black talons, wicked things that tapered into rain-sharp needle points. Not a hand, a claw. George felt like a victim of sleep paralysis, his feet rooted to the floor as the appendage extended into the room, guiding its talons along the wall. As the digits flexed, the nails grazed the wallpaper with a slow deliberation, and the sickening auditory nightmare that had hunted him from the bathroom filled the kitchen. The claw advanced another 3 inches into the shaking beam of his light. An existential horror like nothing he had ever felt before crashed down on him. As a horror author, he had prided himself on inventing nightmares. He had spent years crafting scenes almost exactly like this one, conjuring up the worst, most grotesque entities that went bump in the night. And yet, the raw, physical reality of that fur-covered abomination, tracing lines into the wall, filled him with a dread that shattered his sanity. In that slow motion of absolute clarity, 2 terrifying realizations dropped like lead weights into his stomach. The first was the sudden, undeniable certainty that this monstrous thing was the exact presence that had been watching him from the dark every single time he had braved the spare bedroom or hauled boxes into the attic. It hadn't just broken in tonight. It had been living in the walls for years, potentially even before he had moved here, biding its time and waiting for the perfect moment of isolation. The second thought carried a much more horrific conclusion. He knew with absolute certainty that if he stood there for one more second, if he waited to see whatever face that claw was attached to around the corner, it would be the very last thing he would see on this earth. That did it. George whirled around, his hand seizing the knob and twisting with all his might, tearing the basement door open. Behind him, he both sensed and heard the heavy rushing of air as the massive monstrosity finally cleared the partition. The raw terror that he would see its face if he looked back transformed him into a blind blur of motion. He launched his body forward, flying down the basement stairs like a rocket. the flashlight beam bouncing off the stone foundation in a chaotic strobe effect. "I just have to reach the breaker," his mind screamed over the roar of blood in his ears. "Reach the generator, turn on the lights, and I'm safe." He was halfway down when his roller coaster ride derailed. Time ground to a cruelly slow crawl. He felt the slipper on his left foot catch against the sharp, raised edge of an exposed floor nail. The exact maintenance oversight he had promised Jane a dozen times he would hammer flat, but never did. The momentum tore his foot straight out of the slipper. His balance shattered, his center of gravity left Earth, and he went tumbling forward into the air. Like a scene straight out of a slasher film, he watched the stairs and concrete floor spin up towards him to strike him in the face. The world sped up in a deafening, bone-shattering roar. George crashed like a sack of potatoes against the lower steps, his body tumbling down the remainder of the steps with an almighty, splintering smash as every rib and joint connected with the rough boards. He plummeted off the last step, his momentum launching him hard across the floor until he slammed into an old metal storage shelf. It collapsed under the impact, a barrage of heavy iron rakes and wooden yard brooms clattering to the floor with a deafening din. The flashlight flew out of his grip, skittering away across the basement before coming to rest beneath a distant gun cabinet. For a few seconds, he could do nothing but lie there, his lungs empty as a slow, warm trickle of blood began to seep from a deep cut on his forehead. His left leg was screaming in agony, his brain temporarily forgetting exactly why he'd been in such a mad, desperate dash to begin with. Until the laugh echoed down from the top of the stairs. The sound was the most concentrated injection of pure evil George had ever heard in his life. It wasn't the roar of a simple animal. It was a low, guttural, sickeningly human-like chuckle that mocked his brutal tumble and showcased an intense, sadistic anticipation for the kill. The only sound worse was the heavy creaking that followed as the nightmare began its descent to its prey. Tears of unadulterated fear, not for himself, but the thought of Jane and his boys being left to the mercy of a thing like this welled in his eyes. Adrenaline overrode the pain. He frantically began to crawl forward on his hands and knees, dragging his body out from beneath the mess of fallen metal and wood and attempting to scramble to his feet. The moment his legs took his weight, a blinding flare of agony shot through his left leg. It was either badly sprained or fractured, but as the creak of the stairs drew closer, he forced himself to limp as fast as his body would allow, moving toward the far wall where he knew the generator panel rested. The creaking stopped. The creature had reached the concrete floor of the basement. It was less than 20 feet behind him, and George swore he could feel the foundation vibrate as it took its first stride toward him in the dark. Then the beast stumbled. Through the blackness, the laugh abruptly cut off by a heavy metallic crash and a furious snarl as it lost its footing. The rakes and brooms. The knowledge that the monster had been impeded, even for a moment, caused a final explosion of energy to burst forth. He made a mad dash for the generator, his hip slamming into the heavy edge of the pool table. Another searing bolt of pain shot up his side, but he held onto the felt border for balance, dragging himself around the obstacle. Behind him, a new sound fractured the dark. The beast was no longer laughing. Realizing exactly what its prey was moving towards, the entity let out a colossal, eardrum-bursting growl that would have rivaled a tiger. A sound devoid of anticipation, vibrating with rage. George hit the metal casing of the generator panel like a freight train, his hands ripping open the glass control door to frantically fumble at the manual controls. Behind him, he felt rather than heard the massive, heart-stopping surge of air being displaced as the beast launched into a full, desperate charge across the basement. He had mere seconds left to live. His fingers closed around the power handle, and with every ounce of strength and survival instinct left in his body, George yanked it up. The heavy diesel engine chugged to life, filling the basement with its thunderous vibration. The beast, still rushing towards him, let out a deafening roar of pure rage. George instinctively ducked, his body collapsing into a tight ball as he felt the air above the nape of his neck part, the talons slicing through the air where his head had been a fraction of a second prior, letting out a final scream of his own that was equal parts fear and defiance. He exploded up and lunged blindly toward the wall, clawing his hand against the housing of the master switch. Instantly, the entire concrete room was flooded with light as the long fluorescent tubes overhead flickered and snapped to life with a blinding white glare. The monster screamed behind him again, but it was no longer the deep, guttural bellow of an apex predator. It was a high, shrill, pained screech that rattled his eardrums. George clamped his eyes shut, his teeth grinding together as he braced for the end, sure that his logic had failed, and he would feel the claws tear his flesh into ribbons at any moment. He waited. 5 seconds passed, then 10. Nothing came. After what felt like an eternity, the silence of the basement returning aside from the steady chug of the generator, he could no longer take the weight. He slowly slid his eyes open. The basement was deserted. No leviathan towered above him, ready to end his existence in a blister of pain. His eyes darted across the room, tracking the stone walls, the shadow beneath the pool table, and the dark corners of the room, but nothing disturbed the stillness. Still, he remained motionless against the wall, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as his brain desperately tried to process the vacuum. That thing, I know it was real. It chased me. It growled. It was about to murder me before the lights came on. It was real, wasn't it? But as the lights continued to bathe the room in their stark honesty, a sudden, heavy wave of clarity washed over him, as if the glare had forcefully snapped him fully awake. The rational, defensive side of his brain kicked into high gear, aggressively deconstructing the horror. A single clinical diagnostic phrase floated to the surface of his thoughts, sweeping the supernatural terror away like royalty. He opened his cracked lips and whispered 2 words into the empty room. Night terrors. When he was a small boy, he had been diagnosed with the intense sleep disorder by their old family doctor. He had spent years scaring the shit out of his parents, waking them up in the middle of the night with his screaming and weeping, occasionally dashing blindly into their bedroom to whimper about a shifting monstrosity at the foot of his bed, or a pair of red eyes peering out from behind the closet slats. The specialist they eventually consulted had been the one to suggest George use his journal to write about the nightmares as a potential way to work through the stress. It had been the exact therapeutic exercise that had accidentally set him on his path to becoming a horror author. A soft, deeply relieved chuckle bubbled up in his throat. That's what this is, he thought. For the first time in 15 years, I had a midnight episode. He couldn't fathom what specific subconscious stressor had triggered it tonight, but it didn't matter. The nightmare wasn't real. Wincing, George tested his left leg, letting out a soft groan. He had definitely injured it badly during his tumble, and the slow, warm drip of blood cutting across his left eye confirmed that at least the physical fallout of his episode had been real. Looking back at the mess at the foot of the stairs, he shook his head. I'm lucky I didn't break my damn neck. He limped back across the basement, his bare right foot cold against the floor, and retrieved the flashlight where it lay under the gun cabinet. Crossing back to the stairs, he bent down to slowly pick up the rakes and brooms, replacing them into their rack as best he could. He reached out towards the light switch at the bottom of the stairs, then shook his head again. It wouldn't suck up too much fuel to leave the lights on until dawn. Gingerly, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing, he dragged his injured frame back up the stairs and stepped out into the dark kitchen, pulling the door closed behind his back. Wanting to banish the final wisps of the dream, George aimed his flashlight across the kitchen towards the edge of the partition and the entrance to the living room. For a second, the phantom image of that grotesque, fur-covered claw tracing the wallpaper flashed before his eyes. But as the beam struck the wall, he began to laugh. Caught dead center in the light was a decorative, vintage cast-iron hand hanging out from the wall. 2 sets of car keys and a heavy keyring dangled innocently from the sculpted fingers. It was one of those bizarre, eccentric thrift shop purchases Jane had made last year to fill the empty corners of the house. A piece of decor George had never understood, but had tolerated out of love. In the throes of a childlike night terror, his overactive imagination had taken the dark silhouette of the brown iron fingers and warped them into a slavering, clawed beast. He chuckled again, a deep, comforting sense of safety settling over his tired and sore muscles as he turned his back on the kitchen, prepared wholeheartedly to crawl back upstairs and bury himself in his wife's arms. He limped his way back through the living room, his feet unevenly clomping against the wood. Around him, the house continued to shudder, the midnight storm showing absolutely no signs of breaking, as another flash of lightning turned the world from night to day, followed by another window-rattling clap. Occasionally, a lingering stitch of nerves tempted him to flick on every overhead light switch he passed, but he forced the impulse down. Even without the imagined music and roars, he'd already caused enough commotion downstairs. If he somehow hadn't managed to wake Jane or the boys through all of it, he wasn't about to tempt fate any further. Dragging his injured leg up the stairs to the second floor, he returned to the bathroom, pulling the door closed before snapping the light back on to examine the damage in the mirror. He winced sharply at his own reflection as blood dripped from the cut on his forehead. "Jesus, George," he marveled quietly, his thumb tracing the bruising on his cheek and spreading across his rib cage. "You look like you hit every damn branch of the tree on the way down." Fumbling open the medicine cabinet, he pulled out a bottle of hydrogen peroxide, a box of adhesive bandages, and a tube of antibiotic ointment. Slowly, with delicate, deliberate care, he cleaned the grit from his forehead and bandaged the raw scrapes along his palms, making a mental note to call Dr. Mathis first thing in the morning to have his left leg examined. It didn't feel broken, but the sprain was thick and hot, throbbing something fierce. Flicking the bathroom light off, he exited and paused for one lingering second outside the door to the boys' room. He let out a sigh of relief as he heard their breathing still coming steadily from behind the wood. Thank God for small favors. Turning, he shuffled down the hall to his own bedroom. Pushing the door open, he stepped into the pitch-black room, turning around to aim his flashlight down the empty hallway one last time. The phantom emotions of the nightmare briefly brushed against his consciousness, sending a tiny, cold shiver down his arms. But he quickly dismissed it with a quiet, weary smile. Well, one thing's for certain, he thought, his writer's brain re-engaging as it locked onto the narrative. This is going straight into the upcoming short story collection. If it managed to scare the shit out of me, it'll terrify my readers. He was just about to let out a final, relieved snort when the sleepy, heavily slurred voice of his wife drifted out from the darkness behind him. "George, is everything okay, honey? I thought I heard a huge crash coming from downstairs a few minutes ago." "Shit." George hung his head, keeping his back to the bed, so the beam of the light wouldn't blind her. He had hoped against hope that she had slept through the metal shelf collapsing, but it appeared as deep of a sleeper as she was. Her maternal wiring was too finely tuned. She was always listening for any unnatural noise that might mean danger for the boys. "It's nothing, Janie," he spoke softly over his shoulder, pointing the light at the floor. "Don't worry about it. Go back to sleep." He heard the heavy rustle of the quilt behind him as she shifted her weight on the mattress, her voice returning a fraction of a second later, now sounding much more alert and unyielding. "George, I know you," she murmured, a firm edge cutting through her exhaustion. "And when you tell me it's nothing, it means you're actively hiding something from me. You promised me when we bought this place, before that even, that we would never keep secrets. Now please, tell me what happened down there, darling." George let out a long, defeated sigh, his shoulders slumping. She was right. He had given her his word. As much as his masculine pride detested the idea of admitting he had been terrified by his own shadow, he was compelled to keep his promise. "I woke up to use the bathroom," "I think that alcohol went straight through me," he began, his voice a low, sheepish rumble. "The power cut out, and I went downstairs to fire up the generator for you and the kids in the morning so the house wouldn't be a black icebox in the morning. And I had a night terror, Janie." He paused, a shaky, embarrassed breath catching in his throat. He could feel her eyes tracing over his back from the bed. "I'm not going to get into the raw details of what it was tonight. Maybe tomorrow over breakfast, maybe tomorrow night, but God in heaven, sweetheart, it was easily one of the worst, most vivid episodes I've ever endured, even compared to the ones I had regularly as a kid." He closed his eyes, feeling incredibly small as he waited for her response. But the soothing, infinitely gentle cadence of Jane's voice instantly washed the shame away. "Georgie, honey, it's okay," she whispered softly into the room. "You know I would never think anything less of you for having them again. Tomorrow morning we'll sit down, talk it through, and figure out what brought it on. But for right now, turn that light off, come to bed, and just let me hold you." A profound wave of intense gratitude flooded George's chest, a few warm tears spilling over his cheeks as he silently thanked the Lord above for granting him such an incredible, deeply understanding person to walk through life with. He reached out, flicking the flashlight off and setting it on end on the top of the dresser. The return to the bathroom could wait until the morning. Navigating by touch, he crossed the blackness of the bedroom, dropping like a stone onto the edge of the mattress, and kicked off his remaining slipper. He'd retrieved the other one from the basement in the morning. Right now, all his body craved was the restorative sanctuary of sleep. "I love you," he whispered softly into the dark as he slid his legs beneath the heavy quilt, feeling the mattress shift as he lay down on his uninjured side. "I love you too, honey," her voice cooed directly against his ear, her warmth enveloping his back. George felt the final stubborn knots of tension flee from his body as her arms slid smoothly around his side and over his stomach, her fingers gently beginning to trace her nails across his torso in the dark. A soft, sleepy chuckle escaped his lips. "Let's just hope I don't have another one of those bastards for a long time, huh?" She laughed softly behind him, the movement of her fingers continuing to stroke across his stomach. "Shh," she whispered, her breath warm against his neck. "Forget about it, Georgie. It was only a nightmare." The absolute certainty of her words and the comfort of her presence pulled his consciousness down towards a deep, dreamless sleep, his eyelids becoming impossibly heavy, until a sudden, agonizing flare of pain sliced through his abdomen. George's eyes snapped wide open in the pitch black, his body going stiff. For a single, confused moment, he wondered if he had merely imagined the sting, until her hand moved again. Jane wasn't soothing him. She was digging her fingernails into the flesh of his stomach with such a brutal, crushing force that it felt as if she were trying to tear the skin straight off his ribs. "Janie!" he gasped, his voice breaking into a pained wheeze as he reached down to grab her wrist. "Janie, baby, what the hell are you?" He never finished the sentence. As the words began to leave his lips, the most brilliant, violent flash of lightning of the entire night flashed outside, illuminating the bedroom for a few seconds in a sustained glare. From where he lay in bed, George could see every detail of the room with crystal clarity. He saw the antique oak desk. He saw her vanity mirror in the corner. He saw the white armoire. And he saw the closet door across the room, standing slightly ajar. He saw Jane. George's eyes widened into wide circles of absolute, reality-shattering horror. There, half in and half out of the dark closet opening, lay his wife's body. Her hazel eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, seeing nothing. Her jaw was wrenched open in a silent, unending shriek of pure agony and fright. A thin, dark trail of fresh blood painted the hardwood flooring, leading straight from the mattress to her hands, and even as the lightning continued to strobe, her corpse suddenly jerked, her legs disappearing another few inches into the closet as something hidden deep inside the blackness tugged her further into the void. The existential dread returned with the force of an avalanche. his heart feeling as if it were about to physically explode inside his body. The realization made his blood run cold. If that was Jane on the floor, then who? He surged forward to leap out of bed, but the hand clutched around his stomach instantly tightened with an impossible, bone-crushing strength. The long fingernails dug deep into his stomach, and George felt the heavy warmth of his own blood begin to seep from between them. He opened his mouth to scream a warning for his boys, but before he could draw a single breath, a massive, heavy palm slammed flat across his face, gagging him and muffling his cries into a pathetic wheeze as sharp points began to slice into his cheeks. No, not a hand, a claw. The lightning died away, plunging the room back into blackness. Behind his ear, every trace of his wife's soothing voice melted away, replaced with a low, guttural, demonic growl as a wave of hot, stinking breath fell across the back of his neck.
Shh,
It whispered.
it was just a nightmare.